On the cold morning of October 16, 1793, a 37-year-old woman sat in a damp, dark cell in the Conciergerie, Paris. Marie Antoinette, Joseph-Jean d'Autriche-Lorraine, former Queen of France who once lived in unimaginable luxury at Versailles, was now nothing more than the widow Capet in the revolutionary court records. Today, she would die. But how did an innocent Austrian girl, married at age 14 to strengthen the political alliance between the Habsburgs and Bourbons, end up becoming one of the most infamous victims of the French Revolution? How did someone once called l'Autrichienne, the Austrian, with disgust by the French people, ultimately become the symbol of everything they hated about the old regime? There are several reasons why Marie Antoinette's story became one of the darkest and most complex in European history. This isn't just a story about a queen who lived extravagantly while her people starved. That narrative is too simple and mostly wrong. This is a story about how propaganda can alter the perception of reality, how xenophobia gets manipulated for political purposes, and how an individual can become a scapegoat for the failures of an entire system. Here's what most people don't realize. Marie Antoinette actually became the victim of a propaganda machine that was incredibly sophisticated for its time. Vulgar pamphlets circulating in Paris depicted her as a sexual monster, an Austrian spy, and even made incest accusations against her own son. Libels, obscene publications that spread like viruses through the streets of Paris, created a version of Marie Antoinette that had almost nothing to do with reality. Think about that for a moment. An entire false identity, manufactured to destroy one woman. Before we go any further, if you don't like content involving psychological violence, abuse, and public executions, you might want to watch something else or skip certain parts. But I promise this is about understanding how propaganda and scapegoating work in history, not just a festival of violence. Given all these issues, we need to understand that Marie Antoinette's execution in 1793 wasn't the result of pure revolutionary justice, but rather the climax of a character assassination campaign that lasted more than 2 decades. She became the personification of everything wrong with the Ancien regime, even though, paradoxically, she herself had very little actual political power. Ironically, the woman who would become an icon of aristocratic excess actually spent her final years in conditions far from luxurious. In the Conciergerie, she slept on wet straw mattresses, was guarded by jailers who often verbally abused her, and endured daily routines of humiliation designed to destroy her last dignity as a human being. That morning, October 16, 1793, when executioner Henri Sanson came for her, Marie Antoinette no longer resembled the queen who once wore silk gowns worth hundreds of thousands of livres. Her hair, once carefully maintained by Rose Bertin, Versailles' famous designer, was now white and tangled. Her body, once plump from luxurious food, was now thin from poor prison meals and prolonged stress. And in a few hours, the head that once wore the crown of France would fall into a basket beneath the guillotine, before thousands of Parisians who had been waiting for this moment for years. But to understand how a naive Austrian child could end up in such a brutal way, we have to go back to the beginning, to 1755, when a baby girl was born in the Hofburg Palace, Vienna, and was destined to become one of the most tragic political pawns in European history. Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, Marie Antoinette's real name before she became French, was born on November 2, 1755, as the youngest of 15 surviving children of Holy Roman Emperor Franz I and Empress Maria Theresa. From birth, she was already a political asset. In the 18th century world of monarchy, royal children were diplomatic commodities, and Maria Antonia was no exception. Maria Theresa, one of the smartest and most pragmatic rulers in Austrian history, had a grand vision for strengthening the Habsburg position in Europe. After centuries of conflict between Austria and France, she saw an opportunity to turn enemies into allies through marriage. This wasn't love. This was high-level geopolitics. What made this situation more complex was that the child chosen for this diplomatic mission was one of the least prepared for the task. Maria Antonia grew up as a cheerful and spontaneous child, more interested in dancing and playing music than studying history or politics. Her education, while adequate for aristocratic standards, didn't prepare her for the complexities of French court life. In 1765, when Maria Antonia was only 10 years old, marriage negotiations with Dauphin Louis Auguste, the future king of France, began in earnest. Both kingdoms saw this alliance as key to balancing the power of rising England and Prussia. For Austria, it provided access to French wealth and navy. For France, it opened the possibility of diverting Austrian attention from territorial expansion that threatened French interests. The tragic thing was that this 10-year-old girl had no choice in determining her own fate. Preparation for the transformation from Austrian archduchess to French dauphine began in 1768. Maria Antonia had to learn French perfectly, study the extremely complex etiquette of Versailles court, and most difficult of all, shed her Austrian identity. Even her name had to be changed to Marie Antoinette to sound more French. Abbé de Vermond, the tutor assigned to prepare her, reportedly wrote about his concerns regarding his student's personality. According to his accounts, he described Marie Antoinette as very intelligent but lazy, with a tendency to avoid complex subjects. This wasn't criticism of her intellectual abilities, but an indication that she lacked patience for the political complexities she would face. On April 19, 1770, at age 14, Marie Antoinette was officially handed over from Austria to France in a strange ceremony in a pavilion built specifically on a small island in the Rhine River. This ceremony was both symbolic and literal. She had to remove all her Austrian clothing, completely naked, then dress in French attire from head to toe. Even her little Austrian dog wasn't allowed to cross with her. This ritual, called remise solennelle, was more than just changing clothes. It symbolized that Maria Antonia of Austria officially died and Marie Antoinette of France was born. However, as we'll see, identity transformation wasn't as easy as changing clothes. The official wedding took place on May 16, 1770, at the Royal Chapel of Versailles, attended by thousands of guests from across Europe. This ceremony was possibly one of the most lavish in Versailles history, costing hundreds of thousands of livres, a fantastic amount for its time. Ironically, this wedding's extravagance would become a symbol of the excess that the French people would later criticize. But even more ironic was that this marriage intended to unite two kingdoms wasn't even consummated until 7 years later. Louis Auguste, who later became Louis XVI, was a shy and awkward young man, more interested in handicrafts and hunting than court life or his young wife. This consummation problem became a diplomatic scandal that drew intervention from Maria Theresa, Joseph II, Marie Antoinette's brother, and even royal doctors. The royal couple's inability to produce an heir created extraordinary political pressure. In the monarchical system, dynastic legitimacy depended on continuing bloodlines. When marriage didn't produce children, the Austrian side felt they had been cheated in their political agreement. And this is where Marie Antoinette's first problems began. The French people, already skeptical of the Austrian alliance, began blaming l'Autrichienne for her inability to perform her duty as a royal wife. Pamphlets began circulating, mocking the unproductive marriage and questioning Marie Antoinette's femininity. What most people didn't understand was that this consummation problem was most likely not Marie Antoinette's fault. Some modern historians speculate that Louis Auguste may have had physical issues that made intimate relations difficult or painful, though the exact medical details remain academic debate. What's certain is that in 1777, whether due to medical intervention, maturity, or other factors, the royal marriage was finally consummated. However, those first 7 frustrating years created a pattern that would follow Marie Antoinette throughout her life in France. She would always become the scapegoat for problems largely beyond her control. Half a century later, when historians began reviewing this period more objectively, they found that much criticism of Marie Antoinette was based on stereotypes and gender prejudice rather than facts. But in the 1770s, perception was reality, and the French people's perception of their young Austrian queen was already forming in very negative ways. Life at Versailles in the 1770s was like living inside a golden bubble, floating above French reality. The palace built by Louis XIV wasn't just a residence. It was a political theater machine designed to dazzle and intimidate. But for 14-year-old Marie Antoinette, Versailles became a luxurious prison that isolated her from the real world. Versailles etiquette was an extremely complex and rigid system. Every aspect of daily life was governed by protocols hundreds of years old. Marie Antoinette had to wake up at predetermined times, dress with the help of dozens of court ladies in strict hierarchical order, and live each day with schedules arranged from morning to night. What made this situation more torturous was that, as Dauphine, Marie Antoinette had no real political power, yet she still had to endure all the ritual and ceremonial responsibilities. She was like an actress in a never-ending drama, where she had to play the role of future queen without truly understanding her script. Marie Antoinette's isolation at Versailles was worsened by the fact that she had no true friends. The court ladies surrounding her were political competitors who saw her as a means to advance their own family's positions. Correspondence with her mother, Maria Theresa, was monitored and often censored. Even her relationship with her husband was very formal and distant. In this extremely isolated situation, Marie Antoinette began seeking escape, and the escapes she chose, fashion, gambling, and entertainment, would become ammunition for her enemies for years to come. Here's where things get complicated. Rose Burton, later known as the Minister of Fashion, became Marie Antoinette's confidant and creative partner. Together with Burton, the Queen developed a fashion style that was revolutionary for its time. Dresses in bright colors, dramatic accessories, and hair arranged high with elaborate ornaments. What Marie Antoinette didn't realize was that every new dress, every luxury accessory, and every hairstyle change was reported and criticized by court spies, who then spread this information to Parisian pamphlets. In 1774, when Louis XIII died and Louis Auguste became Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette automatically became Reine de France. But instead of giving her real power, this position actually increased public scrutiny of her every action. One of the most controversial decisions was the renovation of Petit Trianon. Louis XVI gave this small chateau as a gift to his wife, and Marie Antoinette transformed it into a private refuge where she could escape the suffocating protocols of Versailles. She created an English-style garden, built an artificial village called Hameau, and even kept cows and sheep as hobbies. For Marie Antoinette, Petit Trianon was sanctuary, the only place where she could be herself. But for the French public, especially poor people struggling with rising bread prices, Petit Trianon became a symbol of disgusting aristocratic excess. They saw a queen playing farmer with expensive cows while real farmers couldn't afford food. The devastating reality was that this criticism was largely unfair. The cost of Petit Trianon's renovation, while substantial, was only a small fraction of royal expenditures. Louis XVI spent far more money on his passion for hunting and mechanical work. Versailles itself consumed a much larger budget for routine maintenance, but Marie Antoinette, as a foreign queen and woman, became an easier target for public criticism. From all these problems, we begin to see a pattern that would continue to repeat. Marie Antoinette was blamed disproportionately for problems far larger and more complex than she could control. France's financial deficit, for example, was the result of decades of expensive wars, an inefficient tax system, and nobility's resistance to paying fair taxes. But it was easier to blame the foreign queen than acknowledge fundamental systemic failures. Ironically, Marie Antoinette's attempts to seek normalcy and happiness in her life were interpreted as insensitivity to people's suffering. When she invited friends for informal dinners at Petit Trianon, this was criticized as waste. When she participated in amateur theatrical performances, this was considered inappropriate frivolity. When she played cards and gambled, activities very common in European courts, this became evidence of moral corruption. And most devastating was that Marie Antoinette had no mechanism to fight this perception. In the 18th century media system, rumors and gossip spread much faster than truth. Pamphlets depicting her as l'Autrichienne dépensière, the spendthrift Austrian, circulated in Paris streets, while she remained isolated at Versailles with no way to defend herself. By the late 1770s, Marie Antoinette's reputation in the public eye was severely damaged. She was seen as frivolous, extravagant, and most dangerously, disloyal to France because of her Austrian origins. The stage was set for scandals that would completely destroy her credibility, starting with the diamond necklace affair that would transform public perception of her from simply unpopular to actively hated. If we're talking about the most sophisticated character assassination campaign in pre-internet history, the diamond necklace affair of 1785 might be the most perfect example. This scandal didn't just destroy Marie Antoinette's reputation, it literally engineered public opinion to see her as corrupt, greedy, and fundamentally anti-French. What made this scandal so devastating was that Marie Antoinette was completely innocent of the charges brought against her. Yet the justice system and media manipulation successfully made her appear guilty in the public eye. The story began with an extraordinary diamond necklace. 647 diamonds in a very elaborate setting, made by jewelers Baumer and Basseng for Madame du Barry, Louis XV's mistress. When Louis XIV died before the purchase was completed, the jewelers were stuck with a necklace worth 1.6 million livres, an astronomical amount even by royal standards. Desperate to sell this necklace, Baumer repeatedly approached Marie Antoinette, but she firmly refused. She was already too aware of criticism about her spending and, ironically, was trying to appear more modest in her jewelry choices. The entry of Jean de la Motte Valois into this story changed everything. Jean was an impoverished descendant of the royal house Valois, with a fatal combination of aristocratic pretensions and financial desperation. She managed to convince Cardinal de Rohan, an ambitious and naive church official, that she could facilitate reconciliation between the cardinal and Marie Antoinette, who notably disliked him. What was brilliant about Jane's scheme was that she exploited exactly the bad reputation already attached to Marie Antoinette. When Jane suggested that the queen secretly wanted to buy the diamond necklace but couldn't appear to do so publicly for political reasons, this sounded completely plausible to Cardinal de Rohan. Through a series of forged letters, fake midnight meetings in Versailles gardens with a prostitute disguised as Marie Antoinette, and very sophisticated manipulation, Jean managed to convince the cardinal to lend his credit for the purchase. The cardinal, believing he was helping the queen while gaining her favor, signed the contract as guarantor. Of course, Marie Antoinette knew nothing about any of this. The necklace was bought with the cardinal's credit, then immediately dismantled and sold piece by Jean and her accomplices. When payment didn't come and the scandal was exposed, all evidence pointed to Marie Antoinette as the mastermind behind the scheme. The trial that followed was a complete public relations disaster for the monarchy. Although investigations showed that Marie Antoinette wasn't involved at all, the public was already convinced she was guilty. Cardinal de Rohan, surprisingly, was acquitted by the Paris Parliament, a decision widely interpreted as an indictment of the Queen. What made the situation worse was Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI's response to the scandal. They, understandably furious with this humiliation, demanded that the cardinal be punished. But this backfired spectacularly, because the public saw it as vindictive persecution of an innocent cardinal by a corrupt royal couple. The pamphlet wars that followed the diamond necklace affair reached levels of viciousness previously unimaginable. Marie Antoinette was depicted not just as greedy and extravagant, but as sexually deviant, politically treacherous, and morally corrupt. Libels, pornographic pamphlets, began circulating with titles like The Austrian Woman's Debauchery and The Royal Whore, filled with fabricated sexual scenarios designed to completely dehumanize her. Paradoxically, this period coincided with some of the happiest years in Marie Antoinette's personal life. After years of marital difficulties, her relationship with Louis XVI finally became warm and affectionate. They finally had children: Marie-Thérèse, born in 1778, Louis-Joseph in 1781, and Louis-Charles in 1785. For the first time since arriving in France, Marie Antoinette was experiencing real domestic happiness. But the public narrative was completely divorced from reality. Even her maternal devotion was twisted into evidence of corruption. Critics suggested her children weren't legitimate, or that she was raising them with foreign values that would betray France. The deepening financial crisis provided more ammunition for critics. France was indeed experiencing severe fiscal problems, caused primarily by costly involvement in the American Revolutionary War and a deeply unfair tax system that exempted nobility and clergy from most taxation. But instead of addressing these systematic issues, it was easier to blame l'Autrichienne and label her as Madame Deficit. The fundamental tragedy was that Marie Antoinette's actual influence on government policy was minimal. Louis XVI, despite being weak in many areas, was fiercely protective of his royal prerogatives and rarely consulted his wife about political matters. But the public perception that the Austrian-born queen was controlling the weak king and driving policies damaging to French interests became deeply entrenched. By the late 1780s, Marie Antoinette's reputation was beyond repair. She was seen not just as frivolous or extravagant, but as actively evil, a foreign agent working to destroy France from within. The stage was set for the explosion of popular rage that would come with the revolution, and Marie Antoinette was already designated as the primary scapegoat for all the frustrations and resentments that had been building for decades. The greatest paradox was that France's real financial and political problems that would ultimately lead to revolution, were largely ignored in the public obsession with the supposed crimes of the foreign queen. It was easier to hate an individual than confront the complex systematic failures that were actually destroying the kingdom. The year 1789 began with a brutal winter. Harvest failures in 1788 caused bread prices to rise drastically, and thousands of people in Paris were struggling to survive. But what made the situation truly explosive wasn't just economic hardship. It was the combination of financial crisis, political paralysis, and years of pent-up resentment against aristocratic privileges finally reaching a boiling point. When Louis XVI was finally forced to convene the Estates General, the traditional parliament that hadn't met for 175 years, it became clear that the old system couldn't continue. The Third Estate, representing common people, demanded political representation proportional to their population. When denied, they dramatically declared themselves the National Assembly and swore the tennis court oath to create a new constitution. Marie Antoinette, isolated at Versailles, watched these developments with growing alarm. She understood intuitively that the revolution wasn't just targeting monarchy as an institution, but her personally as a symbol of everything hated about the old regime. Letters she sent to her brother, Joseph II, showed that she was fully aware her life was in danger. Then came July 14th, 1789, the day that changed everything. The storming of the Bastille was a powerful symbolic act, but what happened to Governor Delaunay afterward showed exactly what kind of violence was simmering beneath the surface of Parisian rage. Delaunay, governor of the fortress, initially tried to negotiate with the crowd. When it became clear the situation was hopeless, he ordered the gates opened and surrendered. He expected, reasonably, to be treated as a prisoner of war. Instead, he was brutally beaten, stabbed multiple times, and finally beheaded with a pocket knife. His head was then mounted on a pike and paraded through the streets of Paris as a trophy. For Marie Antoinette, who received detailed reports about events, the image of Delaunay's head bobbing above the angry crowd must have been a terrifying preview of her own possible fate. Violence was no longer an abstract political concept. It was immediate, personal, and directed specifically at people like her. The October days of 1789 brought violence literally to her doorstep. On October 5th, a crowd of mostly women, angered by bread shortages and convinced the royal family was hoarding grain, marched from Paris to Versailles. Initially, the demonstration seemed relatively peaceful, but the situation rapidly deteriorated. What most people don't know is that the crowd arriving at Versailles wasn't just demanding bread. They were demanding that the royal family return with them to Paris, where they could be watched and controlled. It was essentially kidnapping disguised as political action. The night of October 5th, 6th was terrifying for the royal family. The crowd broke into palace grounds, and some managed to get into the palace itself. They murdered 2 guards who tried to protect approaches to the royal apartments, and very nearly reached Marie Antoinette's chambers. She escaped literally with minutes to spare, running through secret passages in her nightgown to reach the safety of the king's apartments. When morning came, the crowd outside the palace was chanting for the royal family to show themselves on the balcony. When Marie Antoinette appeared with her children, according to contemporary accounts, someone in the crowd shouted to take the children away. She was forced to reappear alone, facing a crowd that was clearly hostile and potentially murderous. Lafayette, commander of the National Guard, trying to maintain some order, whispered for her to bow to the crowd as a gesture of respect. Marie Antoinette, showing remarkable composure under the circumstances, curtsied deeply. The crowd responded with a mixture of cheers and boos, but the immediate danger passed. But here's what really changed everything. The royal family was now prisoners in all but name. They were forced to return to Paris and live at the Tuileries Palace, where they were constantly watched and their movements restricted. More importantly, the power balance had shifted completely. The National Assembly was now clearly dominant, and the monarchy was reduced to a symbolic role, at best. For Marie Antoinette, the return to Paris was psychologically devastating. Versailles, despite its constraints, had been her home for nearly 20 years. The Tuileries was a prison, even if luxuriously furnished. More critically, she was now surrounded by people who openly hated her and saw her as an enemy. Letters she wrote during this period reveal her growing desperation. She understood that the revolution was gaining momentum and becoming more radical each month. Moderate voices that might have protected the monarchy were being overwhelmed by extremists who wanted complete overthrow of the old system. And she was completely correct. Even as the royal family tried to adapt to new political realities, public opinion continued to turn against them. Pamphlets and newspapers, now freed from censorship, published increasingly violent attacks not just on policies, but on the character and even physical appearance of the royal family. Marie Antoinette, already established as the primary hate figure, became the focus of all revolutionary rage. She was blamed for everything from food shortages to military defeats to the general misery of common people. The fact that most of these problems predated her arrival in France or were caused by factors completely beyond her control seemed irrelevant. Ironically, during this period, Marie Antoinette was actually trying to be more politically engaged and helpful. She corresponded with moderate political leaders, encouraged Louis XVI to compromise with the National Assembly, and even tried to project a more populist image. But the public had already decided she was irredeemably corrupt and foreign, and nothing she did could change that perception. The stage was now set for even more dramatic developments. The revolution that started with demands for political reform was evolving into something much more radical and dangerous. And Marie Antoinette, whether she realized it or not, was already marked for destruction as a symbol of everything the revolutionary movement was determined to eliminate. The war that broke out in April 1792 between France and Austria created the nightmare scenario Marie Antoinette had most feared since the revolution began. For the first time, she was truly trapped between loyalty to her adopted country and natural concern for her family and homeland. Every move she made, or even didn't make, would be interpreted as evidence of treason. Leopold II, Marie Antoinette's brother, who became Emperor of Austria after Joseph II died, was initially reluctant to intervene in French affairs. But pressure from aristocratic refugees and genuine concern for his sister's safety finally convinced him to form a coalition with Prussia to restore order in France. The Declaration of Pillnitz in August 1791, which threatened intervention if the royal family was harmed, was intended to protect Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. Instead, it provided perfect ammunition for the revolutionary government to claim that the monarchy was collaborating with foreign enemies. What made the situation worse was the Brunswick Manifesto, issued in July 1792 by the commander of the invading armies. This document threatened exemplary vengeance if the royal family was harmed and promised to destroy Paris if the palace was attacked. The intention was to intimidate the revolutionaries, but the actual effect was exactly the opposite. It convinced the French people that foreign invasion was imminent, and the royal family was definitely collaborating with enemies. Marie Antoinette was indeed secretly corresponding with the Austrian government, passing information about French military plans and encouraging them to advance. Modern historians still debate whether this constituted treason or legitimate self-defense by a woman whose life was clearly in danger. But from the perspective of the revolutionary government, the evidence seemed overwhelming that the foreign-born queen was actively working against French interests. The cruel irony was that Marie Antoinette's attempts to save her family actually hastened their destruction. The intelligence she provided to Austria was often inaccurate or outdated, and the Austrian military response was hesitant and poorly coordinated. Rather than achieving decisive victory that might have restored the monarchy, foreign intervention only succeeded in further radicalizing French politics. Public reaction to the Brunswick Manifesto was explosive. Demonstrations in Paris became more violent, and calls for the king's deposition became increasingly loud. On August 10, 1792, a mob stormed the Tuileries Palace, massacring the Swiss guards and forcing the royal family to flee to the National Assembly for protection. The scenes from that day were particularly traumatic for Marie Antoinette. She watched from a window as the crowd literally tore apart bodyguards who had tried to protect her. The bodies of Swiss guards were mutilated, and some mob members were drinking their blood or eating their flesh. Violence was no longer an abstract threat. It was immediate, visceral reality that could easily overtake her and her children. The suspension of the monarchy on August 10th effectively ended the royal family's political role, but did nothing to improve their safety. If anything, their situation became more precarious. Without even symbolic protection of royal status, they were now simply prisoners, awaiting judgment from an increasingly radical government. The September massacres that followed showed exactly what judgment might look like. Over the course of several days, mobs broke into prisons around Paris and murdered over 1,000 prisoners, including many who had only tenuous connections to the old regime. The killing was often ritualistic and extremely brutal. Some victims were forced through trials by drunken mobs before being beaten or hacked to death. Princess de Lamballe, a close friend of Marie Antoinette, was among the victims. After refusing to swear an oath against the monarchy, she was literally torn apart by the crowd. Her head was cut off, mounted on a pike, and paraded beneath the windows of the Temple Prison, where the royal family could see it. According to some accounts, the mob attempted to force the severed head through the prison window to terrorize the royal family directly. For Marie Antoinette, the murder of Princess de Lamballe was psychologically devastating. This was a woman who had been a loyal friend for years, and now she was dead, simply because of her association with the royal family. The message was clear. Anyone connected to Marie Antoinette was a legitimate target for mob violence. The war itself continued badly for France throughout 1792. Early defeats fed paranoia about treason and conspiracy, and naturally attention focused on the royal family as obvious suspects. Every French defeat was blamed on intelligence supposedly provided by l'Autrichienne to her Austrian relatives. In reality, the military situation was complicated. French armies were demoralized, poorly equipped, and led by officers who were often more worried about political reliability than the military competence. Austrian and Prussian forces, while better organized, were operating far from their bases and facing a hostile population. Marie Antoinette's intelligence, such as it was, had minimal impact on these larger strategic factors. But perception, as always, was more important than reality. The public was convinced that the foreign-born queen was systematically betraying French military secrets, and this belief became central to the prosecution case that would eventually bring her to the guillotine. Victory at Valmy in September 1792 temporarily relieved military pressure, but also emboldened the revolutionary government to take more radical steps. The monarchy was formally abolished, a republic was declared, and the fate of the royal family was left for determination by the new National Convention dominated by increasingly extreme Jacobins. For Marie Antoinette, war had transformed her from an unpopular queen to an active enemy in the eyes of the French people. There was no longer any possibility of rehabilitation or reconciliation. She was a foreign agent in a time of national crisis, and the only question remaining was what form her punishment would take. The escape plan conceived in early 1791 was a desperate gamble by a royal family that increasingly understood their lives were in real danger. The idea was to escape from the Tuileries, travel to the fortress of Montmedy near the Belgian border, and from there, negotiate with the National Assembly from a position of safety, or, if negotiation failed, escape entirely from France. Planning took months and involved numerous conspirators, including Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, who many historians believe was Marie Antoinette's lover, though this remains a matter of scholarly debate. The logistics were incredibly complex. Forged passports had to be prepared, horses arranged for relay stations, and the route carefully planned to avoid revolutionary patrols. What made the plan particularly risky was the insistence on traveling as a single group rather than separately. Louis XVI refused to leave without his family, and Marie Antoinette refused to abandon her children. This meant traveling with a conspicuous group in a heavily loaded carriage rather than using smaller, faster vehicles or traveling in stages. On the night of June 20th, 21st, 1791, the royal family finally made their escape attempt. Initially, everything went according to plan. They successfully left the Tuileries, met their carriage outside Paris, and began the journey toward Montmedy. For a few hours, it must have seemed they might actually succeed. But the plan began to unravel almost immediately. The royal carriage was much heavier and slower than anticipated, putting them behind schedule from the very beginning. More critically, their appearance was too distinctive. Despite attempts to travel incognito, Louis XVI's was easily recognizable, and Marie Antoinette's aristocratic bearing made her stand out wherever they stopped. The first serious problem occurred at the relay station in Saint-Ménehould, where Postmaster Jean-Baptiste Drouet recognized Louis XVI from his image on assignat currency. Initially, Drouet wasn't sure what to do, but after consultation with local officials, he decided to follow the carriage and alert authorities in the next town. At Varennes, a small town near the border, Drouet arrived ahead of the royal carriage and raised the alarm. Local officials, initially confused about what to do with the supposed travelers, gradually realized they had captured the escaping royal family. By the morning of June 22nd, a crowd had gathered and return to Paris was inevitable. The arrest at Varennes was devastating for the royal family, but particularly for Marie Antoinette. This had been their one chance to escape the revolutionary situation that was becoming more dangerous each month. Now, they were completely at the mercy of a government already suspicious about their loyalties and motivations. More importantly, the escape attempt was interpreted by revolutionaries as ultimate proof that the royal family could never be trusted. The declaration Louis XVI left behind, explaining his opposition to many revolutionary policies, seemed to confirm that the monarchy was irreconcilably opposed to the new political order. Public reaction to Varennes was explosive. Crowds in Paris demanded immediate abolition of the monarchy and punishment for traitors who had tried to abandon their country in a time of crisis. Revolutionary newspapers published venomous attacks on the royal family, particularly targeting Marie Antoinette as the foreign queen who had convinced the weak king to betray his people. The journey back to Paris was a humiliating ordeal that lasted 3 days. The royal carriage was surrounded by hostile crowds at every stop, with people shouting insults and threats. Guards supposed to protect the royal family often seemed more interested in ensuring escape was impossible than protecting them from mob violence. According to Marie Antoinette's later accounts, the children were terrified by the constant noise and hostility from crowds. She herself maintained dignified composure throughout the journey, but letters written after her return reveal the experience was deeply traumatic for her. Arrival in Paris on June 25th was particularly degrading. Crowds lined the entire route from the outskirts to the Tuileries in complete silence that was somehow more ominous than shouting. Placards posted throughout the city demanded punishment for the royal family, and the atmosphere was clearly threatening. From this point forward, the royal family were clearly prisoners, rather than constitutional monarchs operating under limitations. Their movements were severely restricted, correspondence was monitored, and guards were instructed to prevent any further escape attempts. Politically, Varennes marked the point of no return for the monarchy. Even moderate revolutionaries who might have been willing to accept constitutional monarchy began questioning whether the royal family could ever be genuinely loyal to the revolutionary government. Evidence of royal correspondence with foreign powers combined with the escape attempt seemed to prove that monarchy was inherently treasonous. For Marie Antoinette personally, Varennes completed her transformation in the public mind from unpopular queen to active traitor. She was now seen not just as frivolous or extravagant, but as a foreign agent who had persuaded the king to abandon his country in its hour of need. What was tragic was that the escape attempt might actually have succeeded if the royal family had been willing to travel separately, or with less conspicuous transportation. Instead, their understandable desire to stay together doomed the plan from the beginning and sealed their fate as prisoners of a revolutionary government that no longer had any reason to show mercy. The journey back from Varennes to Paris wasn't simply transportation of captured prisoners. It was a carefully orchestrated public humiliation designed to strip away the last vestiges of royal dignity and demonstrate the powerlessness of the deposed monarchy. The National Assembly, after heated debate about how to handle the captured royal family, decided they should be brought back to face judgment. But the method of return was calculated to maximize shame and minimize any remaining sympathy for the royal family among the population. The carriage used for the return journey was deliberately chosen to be open and uncomfortable, forcing the royal family to be visible to hostile crowds at every stop. Unlike their escape attempt, where they could maintain some privacy, the return journey made them constant objects of public scrutiny and derision. Antoine Barnave, the commissioner sent by the Assembly to oversee the return, later described the atmosphere as a terrifying mixture of curiosity and rage. At every village and town, crowds gathered to stare at the captured royal family, with many people shouting insults or making threatening gestures. The children, Marie-Thérèse, aged 12, and Louis-Charles, aged 6, were particularly affected by the constant hostility. Marie Antoinette tried to shield them from the worst abuse, but it was impossible to completely protect them from the psychological impact of seeing their parents treated as criminals by an entire nation. Revolutionary songs were sung throughout the journey, many with lyrics specifically targeting Marie Antoinette. Ça ira, which became the unofficial anthem of the revolution, included verses threatening to hang aristocrats from lampposts. When sung by crowds surrounding the royal carriage, the message was unmistakably personal. The National Guards assigned to escort the royal family back to Paris were ordered to prevent escape, but also to ensure maximum public exposure. Stops were deliberately prolonged to allow more people to gather, and the route was chosen to pass through as many populated areas as possible. In towns like Épernay and Châlons, entire populations seemed to turn out to witness the return of the captured monarchy. Some people climbed trees or buildings to get a better view, while others threw objects or shouted curses. The atmosphere was festive for the crowds, but nightmarish for the royal family. Marie Antoinette's composure during this ordeal was remarkable. Despite constant provocation, she maintained a dignified bearing and refused to show fear or anger that might provoke even worse treatment. Her control was probably crucial in preventing violence from escalating to direct physical attack. In letters written after her return, she described how psychologically devastating the experience was for her. Being reduced to an object of public entertainment, displayed like criminals in a traveling show, destroyed whatever remaining confidence she might have had about the possibility of reconciliation with the French people. The most humiliating aspect was probably the loss of privacy. The royal family was forced to eat, sleep, and attend to personal needs under constant observation from guards and crowds. Basic human dignity, which even common criminals were usually accorded, was deliberately denied to them. Revolutionary authorities clearly understood the propaganda value of this public humiliation. By showing the powerless and captured royal family to the entire nation, they demonstrated that monarchy was finished as a political force. The magic and mystique that had surrounded kingship for centuries was systematically destroyed in a 3-day journey. Arrival in Paris on June 25, 1791, was the climax of the humiliation process. The entire route from the city gates to the Tuileries was lined with silent crowds, silence being more ominous than shouting because it suggested judgment had already been rendered. Placards declaring, "Anyone who applauds the king will be beaten. Anyone who insults him will be hanged," created an atmosphere of suppressed violence that could explode at any moment. Return to the Tuileries was not a return home, it was entry into prison. From this point forward, the royal family's status as prisoners was explicit rather than disguised. Their apartment was searched, their correspondence censored, and their movements restricted to a few rooms within the palace. For Marie Antoinette, the humiliation procession completed her transformation from queen to captive. Any remaining illusions about the possibility of restoring the monarchy or reconciling with the revolutionary government were shattered by the experience of being paraded as a defeated enemy before a hostile nation. More importantly, public reaction to the return showed clearly that the royal family had no significant support among the population. If there had been any loyalist sentiment remaining, it would have manifested during the return journey. Instead, universal hostility demonstrated that monarchy was truly finished in France. The execution of Louis XVI on January 21, 1793, marked a point of no return not only for the French monarchy, but specifically for the fate of Marie Antoinette. With her husband's death, she lost her last protection in the revolutionary system and became a completely isolated target for vengeance from an increasingly radical government. The trial of Louis XVI, now called simply Louis Capet, to strip away royal titles, was essentially predetermined. The evidence presented was largely ceremonial. The real question was not guilt or innocence, but whether execution was politically necessary to consolidate the revolutionary government. Marie Antoinette, imprisoned in the Temple with the rest of the family, was forced to watch helplessly as proceedings unfolded. She wasn't allowed to attend the trial or even communicate with the lawyers defending her husband. Her isolation was complete, and her powerlessness total. Voting in the National Convention was close. 361 deputies voted for death, 360 for alternative punishments. The single-vote margin showed that even among revolutionaries, there was significant ambivalence about executing the king. But radical Jacobins, led by figures like Robespierre and Saint-Just, argued successfully that monarchy could only be definitively eliminated through the death of the monarch. The final hours before execution were agonizing for the royal family. Louis XVI was allowed a brief farewell with his wife and children, but the meeting was conducted under strict surveillance, with guards instructed to prevent any communication that might facilitate an escape attempt or coordinate resistance. Marie Antoinette later described this farewell as the most painful moment of her entire life. She knew she was unlikely to see her husband alive again, and that his death would leave her and the children completely vulnerable to whatever the revolutionary government decided to do with them. On the morning of January 21st, Louis XVI was taken from the Temple to the Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine had been prepared. The crowd that gathered was enormous. Estimates suggest between 20,000 and 100,000 people, creating a festival atmosphere around what was, historically, an unprecedented act of regicide. The execution itself was swift. Louis XVI maintained dignity to the end, reportedly attempting to address the crowd with a speech declaring his innocence and forgiveness for his executioners. But the crowd was too noisy and hostile for his words to be heard clearly, and the moment the blade fell, his voice was silenced forever. Henri Sansom, the chief executioner, later described how Louis XVI's head was displayed to the crowd, provoking a mixture of cheers and stunned silence. Some people rushed forward to dip handkerchiefs in the royal blood, creating grisly souvenirs of the historic moment. News of the execution reached Marie Antoinette quickly. Her reaction, witnessed by guards, was reportedly a complex mixture of grief, shock, and terror. She understood immediately that her husband's death eliminated any possibility of negotiation or clemency for herself or her children. Politically, the execution of Louis XVI transformed the situation completely. European monarchies, which had been reluctant to intervene decisively in French affairs, now saw the revolutionary government as a direct threat to the monarchical system everywhere. War became an ideological crusade rather than a territorial dispute. Domestically, regicide divided the French population into irreconcilable camps. Supporters of the revolution saw it as a necessary step in creating a truly egalitarian society. Opponents saw it as sacrilege and murder that would bring divine punishment upon France. For Marie Antoinette, the most immediate consequence was a dramatic deterioration in her living conditions. The royal family's privileges were further restricted, and she was increasingly treated as a dangerous prisoner rather than a protected captive. More ominously, rhetoric in the revolutionary press began to focus specifically on her as the next target for revolutionary justice. Articles demanded that the Austrian woman face the same fate as her husband, arguing that she was even more dangerous because of her foreign origins and supposed intelligence connections. Psychologically, Louis XVI's execution broke Marie Antoinette's last emotional defenses. Letters from this period, smuggled out of the Temple, show a woman consumed by grief and terror, yet struggling to maintain courage for the sake of her children. She understood that time was running out, and that the revolutionary government was systematically eliminating everyone connected to the old regime. The children suffered terribly from the loss of their father. Louis Charles, now technically Louis VII, in the eyes of royalist sympathizers, was only 8 years old. Revolutionary authorities, recognizing the danger of a child king as a symbol for counter-revolution, began the process of separating him from his mother and subjecting him to intensive republican re-education. For Marie Antoinette, losing her son to revolutionary indoctrination was almost worse than the prospect of her own death. She fought desperately to maintain contact with Louis Charles, but guards gradually made this impossible. By the summer of 1793, Marie Antoinette's situation had become hopeless. With her husband dead, her son taken away, and her daughter constantly threatened, she had lost everything that might have given her life meaning. All that remained was to face her own trial and almost certain execution with whatever dignity she could summon. Conditions in the Temple prison after Louis XVI's execution became increasingly harsh, as Marie Antoinette transformed from queen to widow to condemned prisoner, awaiting her turn to face revolutionary justice. The building itself, originally constructed as a fortress by the Knights Templar, was deliberately chosen for its grim associations with medieval imprisonment and suffering. The royal family's quarters, while not dungeon-like, were constantly monitored and deliberately uncomfortable. Guards were instructed to show no deference to former rank, and many took pleasure in treating Marie Antoinette with deliberate rudeness or cruelty. Privacy was non-existent. Even the most intimate moments were observed and reported. Marie-Thérèse, now 14 years old, later wrote detailed memoirs about this period, describing how her mother struggled to maintain routines and hope in the face of increasing despair. The daily schedule was rigid: meals at fixed times, supervised walks in a small courtyard, and long hours in cramped rooms with nothing to do except worry about the future. The separation from Louis Charles in July 1793 was a devastating blow for Marie Antoinette. The 8-year-old boy was taken from his family and placed under the care of a cobbler named Antoine Simon, who was instructed to eliminate all traces of royal education and aristocratic behavior. The child was subjected to intensive indoctrination designed to turn him against his own family. Revolutionary authorities understood the propaganda value of converting the young king into a supporter of the Republic. They forced Louis Charles to wear the revolutionary cockade, sing revolutionary songs, and denounce his parents as enemies of the people. The boy, terrified and confused, complied with the demands, but the psychological damage was severe. Marie Antoinette could sometimes hear her son's voice from rooms below, but was forbidden from seeing him. Guards told her deliberately cruel stories about how quickly the boy was adapting to Republican values and rejecting his aristocratic family. Whether these stories were true or not, they caused immense psychological torture for a mother who was powerless to protect her child. Letters smuggled out of the Temple during this period reveal Marie Antoinette's deteriorating mental state. Grief for her executed husband, combined with terror for her surviving children and awareness of her own approaching death, created a psychological burden that would have broken most people. Physical conditions also deteriorated. The revolutionary government reduced the budget for prisoner maintenance, meaning poorer food, less heat for winter, and minimal medical care. Marie Antoinette's health, never robust after bearing 4 children and enduring years of stress, began to decline noticeably. Interrogations became more frequent and aggressive. Revolutionary officials, building a case for her eventual trial, questioned her extensively about correspondence with Austria, involvement in counter-revolutionary activities, and supposed influence over her husband's policies. Her answers were carefully recorded and analyzed for evidence of treason. Marie Antoinette's strategy during these interrogations was to accept responsibility for nothing beyond the traditional role of the king's wife. She denied any political involvement, claimed ignorance about state affairs, and insisted that her only concern was the welfare of her family. Whether this was completely truthful or calculated defense remains a matter for historical debate. The most painful aspect of imprisonment was uncertainty about the fate of her children. Marie-Thérèse remained with her, but the girl was clearly traumatized by the loss of her father and brother and ongoing terror about what might happen next. Marie Antoinette struggled to maintain maternal strength while dealing with her own overwhelming fear. Visits from commissioners investigating the royal family's activities became a daily occurrence. These men, often hostile and suspicious, questioned every aspect of the royal family's behavior in the Temple, looking for evidence of escape plans, communication with outside supporters, or continued counter-revolutionary activities. Religious comfort, which might have provided some solace, was limited. Constitutional clergy, priests who had sworn an oath to the revolutionary government, were available, but Marie Antoinette refused to receive sacraments from them, considering them illegitimate. Non-juring priests, loyal to the Pope, were forbidden from entering the Temple. The summer of 1793 brought increasing pressure from sans-culottes and radical journalists to proceed with the trial of Widow Capet. Articles in revolutionary newspapers demanded that the Austrian woman face the same justice as her husband, arguing that allowing her to live encouraged counter-revolutionary hopes. Marie Antoinette understood that time was running out. In letters to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth, who was also imprisoned in the Temple, She expressed resignation about her fate, while continuing to hope that her children might somehow survive the revolutionary period. Psychological pressure was intensified by deliberate isolation from the outside world. No newspapers, letters, or visitors were allowed, except for official interrogators. Marie Antoinette had no way to know what was happening in the larger world, whether foreign armies were advancing or whether any support existed for restoration of the monarchy. In August 1793, final preparations for her transfer to the Conciergerie began. The revolutionary government had decided that a formal trial should proceed, and the Temple was not an appropriate venue for such proceedings. Marie Antoinette's last days in the Temple were spent in agonizing uncertainty about whether she would ever see her daughter again. On August 2, 1793, Marie Antoinette was transferred from the Temple to the Conciergerie, the prison famous as the antechamber of death, because most of its inmates ended up at the guillotine within a short time. This transfer wasn't just a change of location, but a clear signal that her execution had already been decided, and the trial that would follow was merely a formality. The Conciergerie was a medieval fortress that had been converted into a political prison for the revolutionary government. Its conditions were far worse than the Temple: damp cells, poor ventilation, and a general atmosphere filled with despair from hundreds of prisoners waiting for their turn to face the guillotine. Marie Antoinette was placed in a small cell measuring about 3 by 2 meters, with a low ceiling and a single small window facing the courtyard where prisoners exercised under guard. Furniture was minimal: a straw mattress, small table, and wash basin. Any luxury from her previous life was completely eliminated. What made the conditions more torturous was the lack of privacy. 2 guards were stationed in her cell 24 hours a day, observing everything she did. Even the most intimate bodily functions were monitored, creating psychological torture designed to break her dignity before the trial began. The daily routine was deliberately harsh. Wake up at dawn, simple bread and water for breakfast, a short exercise period in the courtyard under heavy guard, then long hours of confinement with nothing to do except contemplate approaching death. The evening meal was barely adequate for survival, and lights were extinguished early. Marie Antoinette's physical condition deteriorated rapidly in these conditions. The prison diet was insufficient for maintaining health, and stress from constant surveillance, combined with knowledge of her approaching trial, caused visible weight loss and premature aging. Guards reported that her hair, already white from stress, became thin and brittle. What made the psychological pressure even worse was deliberate cruelty from some guards. They were instructed to show no respect for her former rank, and many took pleasure in treating her with deliberate rudeness. Some guards made crude comments about her body or sexual history, designed to humiliate and demoralize her. Interrogations became a daily occurrence as revolutionary prosecutors built their case. Pierre-André Fouquier-Tinville, the public prosecutor, was determined to create an airtight legal justification for execution, even though the outcome was predetermined. Questions focused on her correspondence with Austria, supposed plots to escape, and alleged influence over counter-revolutionary activities. Marie Antoinette's defense strategy was consistent denial of political involvement. She maintained that she was simply a wife and mother, with no role in government decisions or foreign communications. Whether this was completely truthful or calculated legal defense, it was probably her best hope for avoiding execution. Sleep became increasingly difficult. The combination of physical discomfort, psychological stress, and constant presence of guards made rest nearly impossible. Marie Antoinette developed severe insomnia, which further weakened her physically and mentally for the trial that was approaching. The most traumatic aspect of confinement was complete isolation from her children. No news was allowed about Marie-Thérèse or Louis-Charles, leaving her to imagine the worst about their fate. Maternal anxiety, combined with her own terror about approaching death, created a psychological burden that few people could have endured. Letters she managed to smuggle out during this period, the few that survived, show a woman maintaining courage in the face of certain death, while consumed with worry about her children. Her primary concern was not her own survival, but ensuring that her children might somehow escape revolutionary vengeance. Medical care was minimal. The prison doctor was available only for emergencies, and Marie Antoinette's deteriorating health was not considered sufficient reason for intervention. She suffered from various ailments, digestive problems, headaches, and possible uterine bleeding, without adequate treatment. The revolutionary calendar had eliminated Christian holidays and religious observances, but Marie Antoinette maintained private religious practices as much as possible. Prayer became her primary source of psychological comfort, though she was denied access to a non-juring priest who could provide sacraments. Preparation for trial involved detailed review of evidence against her. Prosecutors compiled an extensive dossier of her supposed crimes, including treason, correspondence with enemies, and conspiracy against the revolutionary government. Most charges were based on circumstantial evidence or outright fabrications, but legal standards in revolutionary courts were minimal. Public pressure for her execution was intense. Sans-culottes demonstrations outside the Conciergerie demanded immediate trial and death sentence. Revolutionary newspapers published daily articles calling for the Austrian woman's blood, arguing that allowing her to live encouraged counter-revolutionary hopes throughout Europe. In her final weeks before trial, Marie Antoinette achieved remarkable psychological equilibrium. Having accepted that death was inevitable, she focused on maintaining dignity and courage that would be remembered by history. Her primary goal was to face execution in a way that would honor the memory of her husband and perhaps inspire sympathy for her children. The cell in the Conciergerie became the stage for the final act of her life's drama. Here, the former Queen of France was reduced to a condemned prisoner, stripped of all honors and protections, waiting for revolutionary justice to complete the process that had begun with the storming of the Bastille 4 years earlier. The trial of Marie Antoinette, which took place from October 14th–16th, 1793, wasn't a legal proceeding in any meaningful sense. It was political theater designed to provide a legal veneer for a predetermined execution. The Revolutionary Tribunal, under the leadership of Antoine Fouquet-Tinville, had already decided her fate. The trial was simply a formality to satisfy appearances. The accusations were comprehensive and largely fabricated. Marie Antoinette was charged with conspiracy against the revolutionary government, correspondence with foreign enemies, corruption of her husband, and even supposed sexual debauchery that had allegedly corrupted the French court. Prosecutors presented no concrete evidence for most charges, relying instead on innuendo, prejudice, and outright lies. The most shocking accusation came from Jacques Hébert, a radical journalist and politician, who claimed that Marie Antoinette had engaged in an incestuous relationship with her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles. This accusation was so outrageous that it stunned even hardened revolutionary prosecutors, but it served an important propaganda purpose, completely dehumanizing Marie Antoinette in the eyes of the public. Marie Antoinette's response to the incest accusation was one of the most powerful moments in the entire trial. According to trial witnesses, she rose with remarkable dignity that commanded attention even from the hostile courtroom, and responded that nature itself would recoil from such accusations brought against any mother. Her moral authority in that moment was so compelling that even some prosecutors seemed uncomfortable with what they had done. The defense was deliberately inadequate. Lawyers assigned to represent her, Claude Chauveau-Lagarde and Guillaume Doucet de Tronçon, were given minimal time to prepare, denied access to most evidence, and threatened with execution themselves if they mounted too vigorous a defense. They did their best under impossible circumstances, but the outcome was never in doubt. Witnesses called by the prosecution were mostly domestic servants, many of whom were clearly coached or threatened. Their testimonies were filled with contradictions and obvious fabrications, but the Revolutionary Tribunal wasn't interested in evidence, only in creating the appearance of a legal process. Marie Antoinette's own testimony was remarkable for its composure and consistency. Despite physical weakness from months of imprisonment and psychological pressure from certain death, she maintained her dignity and answered questions with calm precision. She denied political involvement, claimed ignorance of state secrets, and insisted that her only concern had been the welfare of her family. What made the trial particularly cruel was its duration. Rather than a quick proceeding that might have been merciful, prosecutors dragged out proceedings for 2 full days, forcing Marie Antoinette to endure hour after hour of accusations, innuendo, and public humiliation. Exhaustion was probably deliberate. A broken prisoner might confess or break down spectacularly for the benefit of watching crowds. Public galleries were packed with hostile spectators who cheered prosecutorial accusations and jeered defense arguments. The atmosphere was that of entertainment rather than justice, with Marie Antoinette serving as the victim in a Roman-style spectacle designed to satisfy the bloodlust of revolutionary crowds. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the trial was the presence of witnesses who had been her servants or acquaintances for years. These people, many of whom she had treated kindly, now testified against her to save their own lives. The betrayal was probably more painful than the accusations themselves. The verdict was announced on October 16th with the predictable result: guilty on all charges, sentence of death to be carried out immediately. Marie Antoinette received the news with composure that amazed even her enemies. She had expected this outcome for months, and had prepared herself psychologically for death. The final hours before execution were spent in spiritual preparation. She was allowed to write a letter to Madame Elizabeth, her sister-in-law who was also imprisoned, expressing forgiveness for her executioners and love for her children. The letter is a remarkable document of grace under pressure, showing a woman who maintained moral dignity even in the face of judicial murder. A constitutional priest was provided for last rites, but Marie Antoinette refused his services because he had sworn an oath to the revolutionary government. She preferred to face death without sacraments rather than compromise her religious principles. This decision required tremendous spiritual courage and demonstrated her integrity to the end. Prison guards reported that Marie Antoinette spent her last night in prayer and quiet reflection. Despite months of deteriorating health and psychological torture, she achieved remarkable peace in her final hours. Her dignity in the face of death would become central to her posthumous rehabilitation as a martyr rather than a criminal. The trial of Marie Antoinette represented the nadir of revolutionary justice, a judicial system that had abandoned all pretense of fairness or legal procedure in service of political expediency. Her condemnation was a foregone conclusion, but her courage during the trial proceedings created the foundation for historical re-evaluation that would eventually restore her reputation. On the morning of October 16, 1793, preparations for Marie Antoinette's execution began with the systematic ritual stripping away of all symbols of her former royal status. The revolutionary government understood that the execution wasn't just the elimination of an individual, but the symbolic destruction of monarchy itself, and every detail was carefully orchestrated to maximize political impact. Henri Sansol, chief executioner from a family that had served in that capacity for generations, arrived at the Conciergerie at dawn to begin final preparations. His task wasn't simply to kill Marie Antoinette, but to transform her from former queen into an ordinary criminal worthy of common death. The first step was removal of any remaining items that might suggest royal dignity. Marie Antoinette was forced to remove a small locket containing hair from her dead children, one of the last personal possessions she had been allowed to keep. Her wedding ring was also taken, despite her pleas to be allowed to wear it to her grave. Hair-cutting was a particularly symbolic act. Marie Antoinette's hair, once her glory, styled elaborately by the famous Rose Burton, was now thin and white from stress. Nevertheless, revolutionary protocol demanded that it be cut short to ensure a clean execution. She submitted to this humiliation with dignity, maintaining her composure even as the last vestiges of her former beauty were eliminated. The costume for execution was deliberately chosen to strip away royal associations. Instead of the silk gowns she had once worn, Marie Antoinette was dressed in a simple, white cotton dress, a plain, inexpensive garment that any common woman might wear to her execution. The white color may have been chosen to suggest purity or innocence, but more likely it was simply the cheapest option available. The binding of her hands was done with excessive tightness, probably designed to cause discomfort during the cart ride to the Place de la Révolution. The executioner's assistants were instructed to ensure that escape was impossible, but the bonds were tighter than necessary for security. This was an additional form of humiliation. Revolutionary authorities debated whether to transport her in a closed carriage, which would be more dignified, or an open cart, which would maximize public spectacle. They chose the cart, wanting the maximum number of people to see the defeated former queen being delivered for execution. Departure from the Conciergerie was witnessed by a crowd that had gathered to catch a glimpse of the condemned woman. Many people in the crowd were hostile, shouting insults or cheering her approaching death. Others, however, seemed moved by the sight of the once proud queen reduced to a common prisoner facing execution. The cart ride through Paris was a slow procession designed to allow maximum public participation in the humiliation. The route was chosen to pass through areas with the largest crowds, and frequent stops were made to accommodate people who wanted to see the former queen being carried to death. Marie Antoinette's behavior during this ordeal was remarkable. Despite physical discomfort, psychological stress, and constant hostility from crowds, she maintained a dignified bearing that impressed even her enemies. Several witnesses commented on her composure and apparent spiritual preparation for death. Revolutionary songs were sung throughout the procession, many with lyrics specifically threatening aristocrats with death. Cha Ira was a particular favorite, with its refrain about hanging nobles from lampposts. In this context, these songs became personal threats rather than abstract political statements. At various points during the journey, the crowd pressed close to the cart to get a better look at the condemned queen. Some people threw objects or shouted curses, while others seemed curious rather than actively hostile. Revolutionary guards had to work to maintain order and prevent the crowd from interfering with the execution schedule. Church bells, which traditionally tolled for executions, were silenced by revolutionary authorities. Instead, drumbeats marked the progress of the cart through Paris streets. The steady rhythm was probably designed to create an ominous atmosphere and maintain crowd excitement about the approaching spectacle. The Place de la Révolution was already packed with spectators when the cart arrived around noon. Estimated crowd size ranges from 20,000 to 100,000 people, making this one of the largest public gatherings in Paris history. The excitement was palpable, with many people treating the occasion as a festival rather than an execution. The final humiliation was the climb to the scaffold in view of the enormous hostile crowd. Marie Antoinette had to be assisted up the steps because her bound hands made balance difficult. Even in these last moments, she maintained dignity that commanded grudging respect from witnesses. The guillotine itself was a machine designed for efficient killing rather than prolonged suffering. The revolutionary government wanted executions to be quick and uniform, eliminating any possibility for dramatic final speeches or prolonged scenes that might generate sympathy for victims. The last recorded words of Marie Antoinette were an apology for accidentally stepping on the foot of the executioner. "Monsieur, I ask your pardon. I did not do it on purpose." Even facing death, she maintained courtesy and consideration for others, a gesture that revealed the character of a woman who had been systematically demonized for years. At approximately 12:15 p.m. on October 16, 1793, the guillotine blade fell and Marie Antoinette died. Her head was immediately lifted high by the executioner and displayed to the thousands of spectators gathered at the Place de la Révolution. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of cheers, silence, and some signs of shock. Even for a hardened revolutionary audience, the sight of a severed head remained disturbing. Henri Sanson later reported that the execution itself was technically perfect, a single clean cut with no complications. Marie Antoinette's composure to the final moment impressed even the executioner's assistants, who were accustomed to dealing with condemned prisoners in various states of panic or despair. Blood from the execution was quickly absorbed by sawdust scattered around the guillotine, but some spectators managed to dip handkerchiefs in it to create grisly souvenirs. This practice, common during executions of famous figures, reflected public fascination with martyrdom as much as celebration of revolutionary justice. The body was immediately removed from the scaffold and transported to a nearby cemetery for hasty burial. The revolutionary government wanted no shrine or memorial that might inspire counter-revolutionary sentiment, so the burial was deliberately anonymous and unmarked. Marie Antoinette was interred in a mass grave at the Cimetière de la Madeleine without ceremony or religious rites. Her body was thrown into a pit with quicklime to accelerate decomposition, ensuring that no physical remains could be recovered for future veneration. The location was deliberately kept secret to prevent pilgrimage or memorial activities. Even in death, revolutionary propaganda continued to attack her memory. Newspaper accounts of her execution emphasized her supposed crimes rather than her dignity in final hours. Articles described her as the Austrian tigress, or enemy of the people, who had finally received deserved punishment. However, reaction to her execution wasn't universally positive, even among revolutionary supporters. Some moderate voices questioned whether killing a defenseless widow truly served revolutionary ideals. Foreign reaction was universally horrified, with even Republican sympathizers condemning what they saw as unnecessary brutality. Edmund Burke, the British philosopher and critic of the Revolution, wrote eloquently about her death, declaring that the age of chivalry is gone, and lamenting the destruction of traditional European civilization that her execution represented. His essay helped establish international perception of Marie Antoinette as a martyr rather than a criminal. Counter-revolutionary movements throughout Europe immediately seized upon her death as a symbol of revolutionary excess. Her execution provided a powerful propaganda tool for monarchist opposition, helping to consolidate European resistance to the French revolutionary government. Within France itself, public opinion began to shift gradually after initial revolutionary enthusiasm faded. As the revolution became more extreme and claimed more victims, Marie Antoinette's execution came to be seen by many as an early sign of the period that would culminate in the Terror. During the Bourbon Restoration in 1815, Louis XVIII ordered a search for the remains of his brother and sister-in-law. After careful investigation, bodies believed to be those of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were discovered in the Madeleine Cemetery and solemnly reinterred in the Royal Cemetery at Saint-Denis. Posthumous rehabilitation of Marie Antoinette began almost immediately after the end of the Revolution. Memoirs from survivors, letters discovered in archives, and historical research gradually revealed how extensively she had been maligned by revolutionary propaganda. Public image shifted from traitor to victim. The Romantic movement of the early 19th century found in Marie Antoinette the perfect symbol of innocence destroyed by political violence. Writers, artists, and musicians created numerous works portraying her as a beautiful martyr who suffered for the sins of her class rather than her own crimes. Modern historical scholarship has continued this rehabilitation process. Access to primary sources, including her private correspondence, has revealed a woman who was far more complex and sympathetic than the revolutionary caricature suggested. While she was certainly privileged and sometimes politically naive, evidence for most serious accusations against her simply doesn't exist. Today, Marie Antoinette is remembered primarily as a victim of one of history's most effective character assassination campaigns. Her story serves as a warning about the dangers of political extremism, the power of propaganda to shape public opinion, and the human cost of revolutionary violence. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of her legacy is that the reputation the revolutionary government worked so hard to destroy has been largely restored by history. The woman they condemned as an enemy of the people is now seen by most historians as a tragic figure caught in forces beyond her control. Her children's fates completed the family tragedy. Louis Charles, tortured by revolutionary indoctrination, died in prison in 1795 at age 10, probably from tuberculosis exacerbated by psychological abuse. Marie Thérèse survived to adulthood and eventually married, but remained traumatized for life by her experiences in revolutionary prisons. Because in the end, Marie Antoinette's story isn't just about an unfortunate Austrian queen or aristocratic excess in an outdated feudal system. This is a story about how propaganda can alter the perception of reality, how xenophobia gets manipulated for political purposes, and how an individual can become a scapegoat for the failures of an entire system. In a world where information travels at the speed of light and public opinion can be manipulated with unprecedented sophistication, the lessons from Marie Antoinette's destruction remain painfully relevant. Her story reminds us that truth and perception are two very different things, and that in political conflicts, innocent people often pay the price for sins they didn't commit. The most tragic thing of all is that the real problems that needed solutions, inequality, corruption, inefficient government, were largely ignored in the obsession with destroying symbolic figures like Marie Antoinette. It was easier to hate individuals than confront the complex systematic failures that were actually destroying society. This isn't a story about the past. This is a story about what can happen to anyone, anytime, when political discourse becomes so poisoned that humanity gets lost in the pursuit of ideological purity. And maybe that's the essence of life. Not how we rise to power or what privileges we enjoy, but how we face inevitable challenges with dignity, courage, and compassion for others, even those who wish us harm. Marie Antoinette, in final analysis, achieved in death what she could never accomplish in life. She became a symbol not of aristocratic excess, but of human resilience in the face of systematic destruction. And in that transformation perhaps lies hope that truth eventually prevails, even when it takes centuries to emerge.